this computer. There we go. So welcome to Political Economics. Again, folks, this is our very first meeting. We are recording this lecture, and then after I will make it available from my YouTube channel. And I will put a link to it on my website. So you just click and then you go straight to my YouTube channel and you can watch the lecture again. So let me share my screen again, folks. What do I want to do here is, let me just find what I want to do. Let me just minimize this. Cannot. Okay, I know where it is now. Okay, let's share the screen, and it is here. Let's share this. So first of all, let me cover a paper with you today. Let me cover the first paper with you. Can you see the screen, the modern impact of pre-colonial centralization in Africa? Can you see that screen there? Okay. Okay, I need you guys to be quick on this. So that's the paper that, let me cover this paper with you, which is essentially, it's exactly what it says on the title, right? So we are going to see papers which I think will help you to not only to get acquainted with the literature, with names and literature and titles, names, journals, etc. But which I think will also help you when you have to write your master's dissertation or even your MPhil dissertation or PhD thesis, right? Because it's going to give you the structure of a paper or how to go about a paper when you have to, because your dissertation is essentially a paper, okay? So let's do this paper first this morning, and then I cover with you, because I assume that, let me assume the null hypothesis here. I assume that you don't know much about writing a research proposal and about writing a referee report. So let's do this paper, and then I cover, because I want to give you instructions on how to write a referee report and a research proposal. So, but before, let's do a paper, and then we go there and try to reconcile the ideas of the paper with the ideas of writing a research proposal and a referee report. Would that be all right? It will be all right, folks, because there is no other way. So let's check this paper. I think it's one of the, I think it's the very first paper which came out in the Journal of Economic Growth. About the title says everything. The modern, and again, it's how to write a paper, right? The modern impact of pre-colonial centralization in Africa, right? The title, it's an informative title. You have the annotation there. It says everything about this paper. It's the contemporaneous impact of past centralization or state centralization in Africa in pre-colonial times. So it is before European colonialism. Okay. I'm not going to use the term European colonization because Europeans didn't colonize Africa. Even in South Africa, the European presence is very limited. Okay, so I'm going to use the term colonialism, European colonialism. So it's the modern impact of pre-colonial centralization in Africa, essentially telling us it's the contemporaneous impact of something coming from the past, which is pre-colonial institutions already in place in Africa by John Aioli and Elia Reiner. It came out in Journal of Economic Growth, which is one of the top subject journals in development economics. Okay, that's the abstract. You have to write an abstract when writing a paper, when writing your dissertation, all the time, which is essentially about 150, 200 words. 200 is a lot of words for an abstract, but I can be flexible. So what is that they do? That I write there the research question, which is essential. What is the research question of this paper? They empirically assess the possibility stressed by African scholars that stronger pre-colonial political institutions, allowed colonial and post-colonial African governments to better implement modernization programs in rural areas. So what is that? What is that very first sentence? They go straight to the point. It's the research question, right? Which is essentially the effects of pre-colonial institutions on modernization programs or on the implementation of particular policies which can lead to modernization. Okay, and that is the very first sentence, right? It's the second. Essentially, they say that it's an empirical paper. It's empirically assess the possibility, right? And then the second sentence is essentially the data. They tell us how they do this. They use anthropological data. Using anthropological data, they document a strong positive association between the provision of public goods, and that is what modernization programs are all about. It's the provision of public goods, and the provision of public goods is essentially delivery of policies, right? We have riots in this country because there is very little provision of public goods, right? And then the governments, they come back to us and they say that they are going to give 350 rand to people instead of public goods, right? So they document a very strong positive association between the provision of public goods, what are public goods? Essentially, when we talk about public goods or provision of public goods, we are talking about provision of education and health, right? We are not talking about airports. The Cape Town airport is a great airport, but that's not that's not exactly what we are talking about when we talk about provision of public goods, right? Such as education, health, and infrastructure in African countries, and the centralization of their ethnic groups, pre-colonial institutions, right? This paper is very much, so my annotation there is the data, which they use anthropological data, which is quite common nowadays, and more on that later. So they are going to explain at some length what is this anthropological data at some point. Again, it is the role of pre-colonial institutions, of the institutions which were already in place when European colonialism started. And European colonialism is very heterogeneous, right? It started in different places at different points in time in the continent. It's a vast continent. What else I found interesting there? And then what is the next sentence? Well, the first sentence of the abstract is essentially the research question. The second sentence, they tell us about the data, right? And the third sentence is essentially the results, and that is it. So the results, they find positive correlations between provision of public goods now, contemporaneously, and pre-colonial centralization. Not all of Africa, folks, not all of Africa had political centralization in pre-colonial times. Not all of Africa, but they pinpoint the areas which had pre-colonial centralization. Not all of South Africa had pre-colonial political centralization, right? Before 1652, right? But some areas had. Okay? Not all of the DRC had, but some areas had. Not all of Nigeria had, but some areas had. Okay, not all of Zimbabwe had, but some areas had, and so on and so forth. Right? So they pinpoint the areas with pre-colonial political centralization, or pre-colonial institutions for short. Okay. So they do find positive correlations, and pay attention here at the way they communicate here. They find correlations. They are not talking about causality. Okay. They find positive, robust correlations. Be very careful. Every time, if you have to use the word causality, that usually is a very strong statement. Okay. What else I found interesting there? And yeah, that's another important thing. What is the mechanism? What is the economics behind those results? Usually students write very bad papers. Honors students are an absolute disaster. Masters a disaster, and PhD students is still a minor disaster, but a disaster nevertheless, right? Because usually, guys, what is missing is not the technique. You can all run regressions. The taxi drivers can run regressions nowadays. It's very easy, right? The problem is that you struggle, and that's my job here, to help you, lend you a hand, so that you struggle less when discussing the results, right? When you put meat in those bones, or when you explain the mechanism or the economics behind your results, right? If there is one thing that I would like you to get away from today's lecture is everyone can run regressions nowadays, okay? Anyone can run a regression. But the important thing is, what is the mechanism? How do you explain your results in a meaningful way? Here they give the economic intuition of the results, right? Say, increased accountability of local chiefs. So the evidence supports the view that precolonial centralization improved public goods provision by increasing the accountability of local chiefs, right? And again, they start by highlighting the role of chiefs in pre-colonial, in the design of pre-colonial institutions during colonial times and also after, right? We have one in jail right now, and if you didn't realize the importance of the one in jail in the riots of 2 weeks ago, well, then you have to rethink the whole dynamics of the country, okay? Which illustrates the importance of the chiefs, for good or for bad. What else I found interesting here, folks? A little bit of policy, very. I'm an associate editor of a couple of journals, of international journals, and of a working paper series. And a lot of people writing about Africa, they love to give policy advice, right? Because they can essentially make money out of policy advice, right? And these guys, they are more serious researchers or economists, and they give policy advice, but it's in passing. Some very in passing policy there, the importance of monitoring the local chiefs when providing public goods, right? So the importance, even if we don't live anymore in a tribal, South Africa is not supposed to be a tribal society, is it? It's in the statutes of the African National Congress, not being a tribal society, right? It's a multiracial society. That's what they strive for. But it is important to keep an eye on the chiefs, those who are in jail and those who are not, right? So I think it's a very contemporaneous paper, folks, although it's more than 10 years old now. And it's a paper, it's not the Bible, right? And papers, there is always another paper coming after this paper with more data or with a different research question. A paper is just a paper, right? But I think those papers that we'll be checking here, they are quite illustrative of what can be done with African data and interesting research questions which can be done within the African context. Let me stop sharing for a little bit to see if there are questions, comments, suggestions, complaints, grievances. All clear? All clear? Okay, if it's all clear, let's move on. So that is the abstract, folks, and the abstract of your dissertation, of your paper, is the most important thing, is the most important part of your paper, because everybody will read your abstract. It's the part of your dissertation that everybody is going to read, right? Because people know that they can get everything they need to know about your paper if you write a good abstract from the abstract. Okay. So let's go to the introduction, which is the second most important part of your paper, because people also read, a lot of people, not every single person, but a lot of people read the introduction, because the introduction is supposed to have the same sort of information, which is the research question of your paper, the data of your paper, and the results of your paper, and the mechanism of your results, but using more words. Okay. And a little bit of motivation. So the first paragraph is usually a little bit of motivation. But I'm not going to, I didn't find anything interesting there. Second paragraph is also a little bit of motivation for the paper. Why is this paper important? I found something interesting towards the end of the second paragraph. Up to this point, the end of the second paragraph, they motivate the paper nicely, also give the mechanisms at work. Right. So they start with two paragraphs. Paragraphs are important, right? Please, when you write your dissertation or your research proposal, use paragraphs, because it gives the reader some space to breathe, right? So they spend a couple of paragraphs. For instance, African history confirms that pre-colonial institutions shape the ability of African societies to undertake modernization programs at the local level, especially in colonial, but also in post-colonial years. Even during colonial times, the importance of pre-colonial institutions were important, because there was especially in former British colonies, there was a strong coordination between the colonial masters and the chiefs, right? And which helps to explain the persistence of this particular institution, which is the role of chiefs. And several historians stress that key dimension of pre-colonial institutions was their degree of political centralization. That's fine. So there was government already in place. In areas inhabited by centralized ethnic groups, in areas with political centralization, the existence of pre-colonial chiefly hierarchy made local chiefs accountable to higher level traditional authority. By bargaining with senior traditional leaders, colonial and post-colonial governments could foster policy coordination and implementation in those areas, leading to faster adoption of European policies and technologies. Right. So essentially that is, and it's always nice to have in a paper, right? By contrast, on one hand, on the other hand, in areas inhabited by politically fragmented groups, the presence of too many traditional power holders rendered such bargaining very costly or infeasible. As a result, in those areas, unrestrained local chiefs were often allowed to follow parochial and personalistic policies, leading to tyranny, disorder, and ultimately halting modernization, right? So that is, we are going to see more of that stuff as we move along, but that is essentially the mechanism. And you don't see, you see, folks, in 2 or 3 sentences, you can actually explain the mechanism quite nicely. You don't need a book, right? You don't need 10 pages to explain the mechanism of your research question. And then that is the research question. The paper assessed the role of pre-colonial centralization in Africa. And how do they do that? That is what is the research question, and there is it's what you do, how you do, and what you find, right? Keep that in mind. What you do, how you do, and what you find. And how do they do that? They use anthropological data on pre-colonial institutions and data on public goods across African countries for the 1960-2000 period, right? And I think here is what they find, the next sentence, and the results again, right? And they find a strong and positive association between the share of a country's population belonging to ethnic groups with centralized rather than fragmented pre-colonial institutions and its provision of public goods such as health, education, and infrastructure, now contemporaneously. Okay. And then what else I found interesting that can help you to understand this paper and to help you to write your own papers. That's still the introduction, page 5. And then because they are talking about something that not necessarily people know about, which is African development. Why would people know about African development, right? They give a sort of historical background and the local accountability hypothesis. So they're going to explain the hypothesis that they are testing, which is the local accountability hypothesis, or the importance of institutions, of pre-colonial institutions in actually constraining local chiefs. Okay. So they do this historical background part of the paper, which I think you should do as well when you write your own papers. Let me see what I found interesting here, folks. Okay, is this the right? I think that's the part I like most when we see numbers. Pre-colonial centralization of public goods in Africa and empirical analysis. Then they are going to explain that they explain the data there. They find data. The anthropological journal Ethnology published several installments of the ethnographic atlas. That's an important name in if you are into this sort of literature. Murdoch 1967 is the ethnographic atlas, where essentially Murdoch essentially provide data of all ethnic boundaries and ethnicities in the African continent, right? What else? Okay, that's finally. And that is, folks, the basic regression specification. Finally, the basic regression, a particular public good against centralization. So it's a very simple regression. By the way, no overly complicated methods there. They essentially do OLS, and you can see from notation, right, that they do, they run a cross section, okay, YI. So, okay, it's essentially YI is one of their outcome measures in country I, and centralization I is the value of their index for that country, right? The value of the political centralization index. As I said, some areas of Africa had more or less political centralization, right? So let's take a look at the regressions, at the results, right? I'm not sure if they put the tables in the paper or at the end. Yeah, I think they put the tables, the results at the end. So let's move towards the end. Let's go straight to the end to see the results, because then when we look at the regressions, we can also make sense conclusions. Okay, before we go to the regressions, let's that's another thing that people read. People don't read what is in the middle of your paper. People will read the abstract, the introduction, and the conclusion. So make sure that when you write your own paper, your own dissertation, that those three parts are spot on. So let's check the conclusion first, and then we move to the regressions. Just in case they put there the research question again, so essentially the conclusion, you repeat everything that you put in the introduction, but you obviously are going to use a different tense of the English language. Just in case a research question again, say pre-colonial centralization, or the role of pre-colonial centralization in some areas, and provision of public goods during colonial and post-colonial times. Recall that they used data starting in 1960, and in 1960, some countries were still colonies, right? So for instance, Portuguese colonies became independent only in the 1970s, just to give you an example. Everything that you say in science, try to give examples, right? Which are usually facts. The results positive correlations between pre-colonial centralization and provision of public goods now. Okay, so positive correlations between the existence of pre-colonial institutions before European colonialism and provision of public goods between 1960 and 2000. Okay. And why is this important? Well, because there is a mechanism, which is the local accountability of chiefs. Okay, so the existence of pre-colonial institutions would put some pressure on chiefs in terms of making sure that public policies such as modernization programs in terms of health and education would actually be implemented. There was essentially an incentive mechanism for local chiefs to behave well. What else I found interesting in terms of policy, the importance of, when modernizing, bearing in mind the role of local chiefs, think in terms of local governments or municipalities in South Africa, or even in terms of the one behind bars right now, right? So our analysis, their analysis, suggests that institutional reforms aiming at fostering modernization efforts in the periphery should be designed so as to optimally respond to local conditions and integrate pre-existing local power structures into the implementation of government programs. So, folks, one thing that I really like doing in South Africa is to drive to Cape Town. So my wife doesn't like the N1, so I go through N12 through Kimberley, and we go through all those villages in the Karoo, and it's really bad. There is no state capacity there, folks. There is, well, very little. There is no even, that's not even garbage collection anymore. So it's interesting, it would be an interesting research question would be to see if in those areas, for instance, in the middle of nowhere in the Karoo, and the Karoo is inhospitable to humans, right? Is inhospitable to humans. It's not inhospitable to sheep, but it is inhospitable to humans. So my hunch, when we look at the map of the ethnic boundaries, my hunch, in fact, it's not my hunch, folks, I am pretty sure that there was no political centralization in the middle of the Karoo before pre-colonial times, and therefore there is very little state capacity there contemporaneously. Okay, so it's there are you guys have to, my job here is to bring you closer to the technological frontier, is to bring the best international practices to your doorstep. So there are plenty of research questions which you can actually, these guys did for the whole of Africa. You can do that for different areas of South Africa, this sort of a study. And I think it would be very interesting to know if really that is the case, right? If there was less political centralization and probably less chiefs in the middle of nowhere in the Karoo, and provision of public goods now. What else I found interesting in this paper? Let me see what time. Okay, we are doing well. And policy again, and the importance of having the role of local chiefs. So now allowing decentralization to take place. We have to be very careful, folks, about implementing particular policies across the board, because we have to take into consideration the existence or non-existence of local chiefs in particular areas when implementing modernization programs such as provision of education and health goods. Right. Their analysis illustrates that in the presence of profound socioeconomic inequalities, decentralization may allow local administrators to distort the implementation of public programs to their own advantage. Does it sound familiar? Disregarding the broad interests of their communities. Okay. What else I found interesting? I think that is it. And then there is the references. Usual suspects are there. Semoglu, Alberto Alesina, big names in our profession. Alesina there again. I don't know these guys there. Barrow, Robert Bates, Bates again, Tim Besley, Blanchard, Bocchetti, Breitenbach, but not our own Breitenbach, huh, folks. Not our good old Martin. That's a different one. Francesco Caselli. So those are William Easterly and Ross Levine. Those are respectable names. That's also Laporte. Respectable names in our profession, folks. Right? Murdoch. And you can see that Murdoch was doing his research back in the 50s and 60s, right? Nathan Nunn. Schleifer again. There we go. Okay, let's go to the tables. They use Ugandan data in addition to more general African data. They also use Ugandan data. That's Uganda, and they have in there they have centralized ethnic group, and Buganda and Langu fragmented ethnic group, right? Distribution of centralized and fragmented ethnic groups across Uganda regions. Okay. Buganda here, right? More centralized in terms of not being more central, but in terms of having more political centralization. And then at some point they are going to compare one group with another in terms of provisional public goods. Here, folks, that's very nice, right? Some pictures, some plots between centralization and percentage of roads paved, pavement, roads, pavimentation between 1990 and 2000, and that's African countries, right? And we see the positive correlation between political centralization, pre-colonial political centralization, and percentage of roads paved, right? I don't know where South Africa is. I don't know if South Africa is in this data set. I don't see South Africa. All right, I don't see. So what, like positive correlation between centralization and roads between 1990 and 2000. What else I found there? Centralization provision of health again, political centralization against percentage of infants immunized for DPT. And again, we see which is a provision of a public good, vaccination, right? And again, we see the positive correlation. I don't know whether South Africa is in this data set or not. I don't see it. If you manage to see South Africa there, please let me know. I don't see it, right? Then again, more plots, less infant mortality with more centralization. So here, obviously, we expect a negative correlation, right? Infant mortality is decreasing on political centralization, right? And infant mortality is probably a proxy for health goods provision. This is not South Africa, I think, right? This is a year on the former DRC. I don't see South Africa there. Okay. And then here, adult illiteracy rate or provision of education. Again, we expect a negative correlation, less illiteracy or more literate people with more centralization. So we expect a negative correlation there, right? Between political centralization and education or less education. And there are more pictures there. Always populate your papers with pictures because they are essentially showing their results using pictures, right? And here we expect a positive correlation, more education with more centralization, more delivery of education in terms of public goods between 1960 and 1990. So a positive correlation between provision of education and political centralization. What is this? I don't find this interesting. Precolonial infant mortality. I don't find this interesting. Didn't find that interesting either, or that one. Aha, regressions. Okay. Pre-colonial centralization of public goods in Uganda. Let me see what I wrote there. Some evidence from Uganda where there are areas with less and more centralization. We can see some difference in terms of public goods provision. So let's say, so you can see the public goods proxies there, percentage of roads paved in 2002, infant mortality in 2001. We can see the positive correlations, right? But you can see that the numbers, the effect of the estimates, let's say, let's look at infant mortality, right? You can see that the size of the effects change depending on whether they are talking about a politically centralized area or a fragmented area. And that matters. Why? Because it matters for policy, right? Because when you are describing your results, we are going to also to tell the reader or the policymaker about the size of the effect of a particular intervention. Okay, so that matters. The size of the effect matters. You can see that the size of the effect, the numbers are different, or the effects are different, right? In the same here, right? Percent of children under 5 years with diarrhea, the same there. Okay, the size of the effect where central and western areas are more centralized, right? So there are less people, less kids with diarrhea, and where there is more fragmentation, the percentage of kids with diarrhea is much higher. Okay, and so on and so forth. Availability of sewerage is system in 2000. You can see that percentage of households in politically centralized areas is higher for availability of sewerage system than in more fragmented areas. Again, the size of the effects matter for policy prescription. Piped water inside the house in 2000, again, it's higher in centralized than in, especially in this more fragmented area there, which presents smaller effects. Availability of latrine or human waste disposal, it's higher in more centralized areas than in fragmented areas. And adult literacy rate in 1997 is higher than in centralized areas than in fragmented areas. Okay, folks, I hope that makes some sense to you. Those are all OLS regressions. See there, the main results and OLS regressions. Okay. Centralization, again, let's do it. You can see there, I hope you can see, right? Percentage of roads paved with centralization is positive. Percentage of infants immunized, positive. Infant mortality, obviously, we expect a negative correlations. Illiteracy, negative, we expect that. And the school attainment is positive on centralization. Okay, so let's see what else they have there. Let me see what I write there. And then some robustness. Let me just with different samples, centralization. Again, folks, trying to highlight that. Again, using different samples and subsamples of African countries. Centralization, again, is positive with roads, positive with immunization, negative with infant mortality, negative with illiteracy, and positive, again, with school attainment, right? And then they use, so that's centralization, then they use some subsamples. That's the main sample. And then they use some subsamples excluding Liberia and Sierra Leone, where there is a lot of fragmentation, and excluding Lesotho and Swaziland, where there is a lot of centralization, right? We know that as we speak, those are very centralized African societies. And then they exclude North African countries, where there was also a lot of political centralization, right? And the results, essentially, this is a robustness test. The results are robust, right? As far as my eye can go, it's positive where it should be positive, and it's negative where it should be negative, and it is positive again where it should be positive, right? Then there are a bunch of more regressions there, folks, more robustness tests, but I am introducing you to the main results. You can go there, and there are plenty of results in there, plenty of robust. Everything else that you are seeing now are robustness. To make sure that the results, there is an appendix where they explain the data in more detail, where they give the definition of the data they are using. And again, more info on data and sources of the data. I just want to find here the variable centralization, because that is the variable that they put together, right, using the ethnographic atlas. For each country measures the share of the non-European population that belongs to indigenously centralized ethnic groups. The scale is 0 to 1. Okay, an ethnic group is defined as centralized if it has 2, 3, or 4 jurisdictional levels above the local community, according to Murdoch's jurisdictional hierarchy variable. Right, so they explain how they construct the variable centralization, because everything else, folks, you can see comes from Baron Lee, from World Bank, from World Bank. Everything else are essentially standard stuff, and World Bank again, and World Bank again. That is standard, right? Those are variables which are off the shelf. You can go to a data aggregator. You can go to our world in data and gather that data. So the innovation here, apart from the research question, the innovation here really is this variable there, centralization. Okay. Everything else again, GDP is PAN World Table. GDP per capita again is World Bank, and population World Bank. You can see everything else, population density is World Bank, urbanization is World Bank. Everything else is essentially off-the-shelf data, right? So the innovation really is putting the centralization, political centralization. Everything else is CIA, World Bank. You can find that easily. You can see that, and then Appendix 2, precolonial politics in Sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, so here they show the actual variables, the index. You can see Comoros, Lesotho, and Swaziland as the most politically centralized areas, and for instance, Liberia and Sierra Leone as the most fragmented ones. Okay. So you can see, let me see if South Africa is there. I don't think it is, right? Don't ask me why, ask them why South Africa is not there, probably because there is no data. They couldn't get the data. Okay. Zimbabwe is there, obviously, because of the Great Zimbabwe and because of the splinter group, which created a different ethnicity in Zimbabwe, right, coming from the Zulus. And then they also provide the usual, that's the summary stats, or the descriptives are there. And correlations, pairwise correlations are also there. And everything else here is things which should be in the appendix, right? More results, and more appendix, more information about the data, because the data is an important thing in this paper. So let me stop sharing. And questions, comments, suggestions? Any question whatsoever? Are you guys still there? Okay. Then let me share again. Let's so if there is no question about this paper, Let me share again my screen. No questions from my side. Okay, thank you. Yeah, as I said, the idea is to introduce you to those papers, right? Not to go into too much detail, although we spent, that's more or less the amount of time I want to spend on each paper, 45, 50 minutes. Okay. I introduce you to the paper, and then you go and ideally you actually read the paper, right? And I'm also essentially kind of telling you how to read a paper, what you should read on a paper, right? If it is obviously, if it is a very important paper in your subject, you read the whole paper. But if it is it's an important paper, but it's we are going to cite that paper, but it's not really the paper that you are using as the main source. You know what to read. You read the abstract, the introduction, the conclusion, and you take a look at the main results, right? So let me share my screen again, and let's okay, this one, and let's talk about your assessment, right? So this is also available from my website already there. The research proposal, right? I'm going to give you some pointers on how to write a research proposal here. And if you need to know more details about the research proposal, you can also check my website, the research methods course that I gave in the first semester, and there is also notes, more detailed notes in there, which you can probably benefit from. But I'm assuming you already kind of have an idea, vague idea, on how to write a research proposal. And I assumed, quite rightly, that honors students, your colleagues, didn't know a thing about how to write a research proposal. So that there is a little bit more details in those notes. But you need a research proposal to pass this course, right? It's worth half of the mark. You need a research proposal, and it must be no longer than 2,000 words, right? Why so short? Well, because you have to go to the point very early on, folks. You are doing science. You are not rewriting the Bible, right? Or the Torah. You are writing a research proposal, right? And it must not, I should have put not in bold, longer than 2,000 words or 5-6 pages, excluding appendices. If you have any footnotes, ideally you don't have footnotes. If something is important, you write it in the main body of your paper. And if something is not important, you don't write it at all. So footnotes are a useless distraction, right? They do not look professional. They do not look illustrative. They show that you are a student, right? Students love to write footnotes. So you are showing your age when you overpopulate your paper with footnotes. So avoid them. At least for my course, avoid them. Tables, maybe you already, in your research proposal, you are going to run some regressions and some correlations, and you can show the tables and references as well. Well, references, they should be there. And your proposal must address the following. As I said in the first paper, what's the purpose of your paper? Or to be more precise, what is your research question? What is that you are doing? Say, what is the hypothesis that you are testing? So those guys in the first paper, they were testing a clear hypothesis. The role of pre-colonial institutions or political centralization on contemporaneous provision of public goods. And there was a hypothesis in the middle. Remember, there was a mechanism. Okay. So that's the first part. That's the first thing in your research proposal. After you introduce yourself, you put your name in there. Is exactly as I did there. Research methods, your name, your affiliation, and the date, and everything else is useless and unnecessary distractions. Okay, you state very clearly and very much to the point what is your research question or what is the hypothesis that you are testing, and you only test one hypothesis. You don't test two hypotheses, right? It's just a master's dissertation or a PhD paper. So it's only one hypothesis, to the point, simple, precise, concise. And then, okay, okay, you have this very odd hypothesis I never heard of, but maybe it is worth investigating. So why? So we are going to motivate. Why is it important? Or why is it an important or worthwhile question? Does it matter to people? Does it matter for policy? Does it matter for welfare? Why is it interesting? Avoid questions, folks, where only one answer is interesting. In science, there is no good, no bad, or doesn't work, right? It's science. We are supposed to be precise, concise, clear, okay? Avoid, if your results are not significant, it's not a bad thing. It's essentially, you are conducting an exercise, an empirical exercise, properly done. If your results are all zero, essentially, or statistically insignificant, essentially everything is zero, it's not a bad thing. It's essentially the data is not there for you. Okay, but you are conducting your exercise precisely. That's what really matters in science. So avoid those sort of intellectual, mental straitjackets. Okay. Literature. What past research has shown? Another mistake of students and of some old school academics in this country, because of the isolation of the 80s and 90s, they write long literature reviews. It's a mistake. It's a big mistake, right? Literature reviews are supposed to be very much to the point, be concise and precise. We are talking about the 3 or 4 top papers, not papers published in an obscure South African journal in 1988. Nobody was interested in South African science back in the 1980s for obvious reasons, right? South African universities were not really very good back in the 1980s for obvious reasons. We don't do science in isolation, right? Where was I? 3 or 4 top papers written by the 3 or 4 leaders and published in the 3 or 4 top journals. It is essential. One of the first things I do when I have to read your work, I start from the end. I go straight to the references, and I'm going to check if you have been citing the top papers in your subject, right? I will check if you are reading papers in the American Economic Review, in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, in Econometrica, in the Journal of Economic Growth, in all the top journals. There is no use in you guys reading obscure papers published in obscure journals. There is no use, there is no scientific use, right? And usually those are overly complicated papers, not easy to read. A paper published in a top journal is much nicer to read in any way, okay? So do not make that mistakes. Do not make that mistake of doing or writing very long literature reviews and basing your work on obscure papers published in obscure journals which have no relevance whatsoever. And then what is that you have to say about a paper that you are reviewing? Well, essentially, you say what this paper is about, the research question, how this paper was done, the data, and the results, the findings. But essentially, what are the weaknesses and gaps in this literature? At the end, you have to tell, well, and after reviewing these 3 or 4 or maybe 5 top papers in the top journals, you are going to write a final paragraph. You are going to wrap up your literature review and say, what are the weaknesses and gaps in this literature that you are attempting to mitigate, right? What are the possible weaknesses of your own paper, given the data you have? You have to be critical, although respectful towards the previous papers, but you also have to be critical about your own paper, because your own paper, again, you're not rewriting the Bible, right? You are just writing a paper. Very few people will read your paper, okay? Essentially you and your supervisor, right? But you have to be precise, you have to be concise, you have to be polite, right? So, and honest. What are the weaknesses of your own paper, given the data you have? Oops. Let me put it there. There we go. The method, or how you do it. Again, you start by telling the reader what is your research question. Then you motivate your research question. Then you review the literature. Those are different sections of your research proposal. Right? Then the next part or section of your research proposal is the method, or how you do it. That is to say, what is the data set that you are using? What are the, how do you explain your data set? Well, you are going to describe not only what is the definition of the variables that you are using. I showed you in the paper how they define the main variable that they are using. The variable, you are going to describe the definition. You are not going to plagiarize. You are going to use your own words. You are going to describe the variables that you are using. You are going to tell the reader the sources. Remember, I highlighted the sources of those variables. And also, you are going to tell us what is the econometric technique that we are going to use. Well, the econometric technique is given by the sort of data that you have. If you have panel data, you are going to use panel data techniques. You are going to use fixed effects, or you are going to use random coefficients, not random effects, because economists don't like random effects, right? I know we still teach random effects in the department in this country, but we don't really like it for obvious reasons, because it assumes that everything is very well behaved. What is the specification? Remember, we saw in the paper a regression. So that is the specification, and why that is your specification. And possible problems that you might have, right? For instance, maybe you have missing data, maybe you have endogeneity, measurement error. All those things are present in data sets. Okay. Okay, let me stop sharing here and see if there are questions. Questions, comments, suggestions, complaints, grievances. Anything, guys, anything.
Good morning, Prof.
Good morning, go ahead.
Yes, for the research proposal, are we supposed to choose our own topic, or it is supposed to be in relation to political economics?
That's a very good question. Thanks, Frederica. Can I sit on that for a while? Because ideally you choose one of the topics that we are doing here, okay? But I also, in principle, I wouldn't mind you using your own topic of your own subject of interest. But can I decide this by next week? Let me sit on that. Let me mull over it. Do you mind?
Okay, thank you.
Because even if I tell you what to do next week, you guys still have a lot of time. Okay. In principle, I don't have a problem in terms of being flexible. But let me decide next week, Frederica.
Okay, thank you.
Any other question or comment? Okay, let me do the referee report, and then we have a break. Okay, let me share my screen again. Let me go there. Okay, there we go. Okay, so that is some comments, and I think it's important, guys, that as we move along the course, that you come with questions about the research proposal. Okay, I put a lot of information. I condensed a lot of information in one slide. Right? That's not how you should. That's not how you should write a slide when you are presenting a paper. So, but that's a slide for teaching purposes. So a slide shouldn't be that congested with information, right? So, but I think you should come with questions and comments about your own research proposal as we move along and as we see more papers. Okay. So let's do the paper report, and then we have a break. Let's do another 15 minutes, and then we have a break. So the paper report. I will bank on the idea that you never wrote a paper report. Okay, so I'll assume the null hypothesis. So what is the purpose of writing a report? The purpose of writing a report on a paper, and in that, answering Frederica's previous question, that is, you have to choose one of the papers that we are going to see in this course, right? So what is the purpose? The purpose of writing a report on a paper is firstly to summarize the paper. So you have to summarize this paper, and then in a paragraph, and I'm going to give you more info as we move along. With your comments, improve the paper. It's your job to improve, to provide the author with comments so that this paper can be improved and therefore eventually published in a professional journal. A report should be 3 pages long. Not too long, not too short, 3 pages long. Also important, you must be concise and precise. They are in bold for a reason. Concise and precise. In addition, you have to use, you are professional economists now. You already have an honors degree, right? You have to use econometric terminology and jargon, and be familiar with the related literature. Otherwise, if you are not familiar with the related literature of this particular paper that you are referring, if you are not familiar, then you are not qualified to write a report. Okay, because the comments that you are going to provide are based on what has been done before. We stand on shoulders of giants. Okay. You have to state how the paper compares to related papers in the literature. In science, everything is about comparison, is in relation to something, right? For instance, how does it move a step forward with respect to previous papers? Is the hypothesis slightly different? What about the method and data set? And the data set is very important, right? Because nowadays the research questions are essentially very similar. The research questions in political economy and in development, they are very similar. Why is some areas of South Africa doing better than others? Or why some countries do better than others, right? Why there is so much variation in terms of, thank you, in terms of development across nations, or even across different regions within particular countries, right? Why? Essentially, those are the questions in this particular area. Why the Western Cape, why some areas of the Western Cape do better than the Eastern Cape, right? Why, you see, why is it because of geography? Is it because of the chiefs? Is it because of previous political centralization? Is it because of the people? I don't know. It's your research question, right? But that's the usual research question that we have in this subject, which makes the whole thing. It's not about, oh, what is the importance of financial flows on Zimbabwe, or what is the importance of fiscal policy? What fiscal policy? We don't have fiscal policy in this country. We don't have policy, right? We have the Treasury doing the same thing for 120 years. Very little imagination. Doesn't matter who is in power, right? Very little imagination. So those are, from my perspective, and from the perspective of people I enjoy talking to, very you can write a book about that stuff, but it's really not interesting from my perspective, right? But and usually in this area, there is a bunch of brand new data sets, right? Very interesting. The second paper that we are going to see that it's a step forward. It's about the same subject. It's about pre-colonial political centralization, but we are going to see that the guys, they are using a more innovative data set. And that is the advantage. That is the gain from the first paper, right? That doesn't make the first paper wrong or stupid, not at all. It's the first paper on that subject, right? But the second paper is even more innovative because they are going to actually see the ethnic boundaries. They are going to disaggregate the macro data that the previous guys used, right? Is it a new data set just released that they are using, or an old data set that nobody has used before, and now you are formatting and putting this data set in a nice format so that you can use it? So let's see. Those are the different sections of your paper report. And again, I'm going to introduce you to the structure of the paper report, and I hope, guys, that you ask questions as we move along these 6 weeks. So the first section of your paper is summary. So you write it summary. You follow my instructions, okay? You have to summarize the main contribution of the paper. Also, you tell the editor what is the research question, and that is the summary, right? Everything that we are going to do for 6 weeks is about what is the research question, and then what is the method and the data, or how they do things. So what they do, what is the research question, how they do, method and data, and what they find, the findings, okay? You have to tell the editor in 3 sentences those things. The editor is myself, right? For this assessment. You have to tell them the research question of this paper is this. And they use OLS and panel data, right? And they find this. The editor doesn't want to know your opinion at this stage, because at some point you are going to have to give your opinion. You will decide whether this paper is going to be published or not, right? So, but not at this stage. The editor doesn't want to know your opinion now. Specifically, you have to tell the reader, in this case, the editor of the journal, the following. The research questions or goals of the paper. I'm just repeating myself. The theoretical model, even if in this case you are going to read an empirical paper, right? But there is a mechanism, there is a model, there is a verbal mechanism there. In this case, even if there is no theoretical model written in mathematical terms, you have to explain the hypothesis that the paper is attempting to test empirically, right? You have to explain to the reader what is the mechanism, what is the hypothesis, what is the economic intuition of the empirical exercise, okay? The empirical methodology, that is to say, is it panel data, is it cross-section, is it time series? You have to tell the reader, the editor, I'm just repeating myself. What is the method that these people are using? The previous guys, they use cross-section. Remember the terminology. It was a cross-section, right? One data point. They took the averages. They didn't use panel data, although they had the panel, but they took the average of everything, so they constructed a cross-section. The data being used, that is to say, how this data set was compiled, what countries or time periods it covers, the sources, etc. And the main results obtained. And they find this, and they find that there are positive correlations between provision of education in 2000 and pre-colonial, and the existence of pre-colonial institutions in pre-colonial times, right? The main thing is be precise. You can do all those things in a paragraph. You can do all those, right? You can summarize the paper. What is the research question? What is the data and method? And what are the findings in one paragraph? And ideally, I am expecting you to do in one paragraph, and not in one long paragraph, but in one paragraph. Okay. Be precise. One paragraph. 3 or 4 sentences. That's all. Now, the second part of your report, the second section of your report, comments, criticisms, and suggestions. That's why I'm always asking you, do you have comments? Do you have criticisms? Do you have suggestions? Because that's how we do in science. There is no problem in having comments, criticisms, and suggestions. You have to provide at least 5 suggestions, criticisms. Oops, there is a bit of double counting there. 5 suggestions and criticisms, and you can ignore the second suggestions to the authors. All right. Again, be precise. For every problem or criticism you raise, you have to offer an alternative. For instance, if you think that something is endogenous, if you think that there is an endogenous relationship between political centralization, and in this case, it couldn't be endogenous, right? Because political centralization in pre-colonial times is being regressed against provision of public goods now. So, because it's a historical regression, there is no problem of endogeneity there. Okay, because it's a historical regression. There is no. It's impossible for a contemporaneous outcome to have an effect on something that happened 200 years ago. Okay, so there is no endogeneity in the previous paper. There is no need for an instrumental variable, but maybe there was a need. Maybe if they were regressing the power of chiefs now against policies now, then that relationship would be endogenous, and therefore it would deserve a comment about endogeneity, and therefore you could say, well, maybe this relationship that they are testing is endogenous, and the authors need to either to have a more innovative data set with the before and after, or an instrumental variable, right? So you have to, okay, you raise a criticism, but you also provide the author a solution, an idea for them to come up with a solution. Then you have to provide an idea for a plausible IV or a better identification strategy so that they can circumvent somehow the problem of endogeneity. You have also to think critically about a paper, but also be constructive, right? We are not members of the EFF, okay? We have to be constructive. We always in science have to be constructive. EFF people, they don't have to be constructive because they are not doing science, okay? It's fine. It's absolutely, they are doing what they do, but we have to do what we do. Okay, we have to be constructive. Specifically, is the research question precise enough? Maybe it's a loose research question. I don't know. I don't think you guys are going to see any loose research question because all these papers that we are seeing are top papers, right? They have already been published. They are very tight. They are very nicely written. They are very tight. Right? And the empirical method, is it the right methodology given the data set available? Maybe they are using a stupid methodology. I don't think they are, because those are very tight and very nice papers. They have already been published, right? But it's your job for this exercise to provide comments on the method. What about the model itself, the regression, right? Is it reasonable? And the results, do they answer the research? Are the results helping the authors to answer the initial research question? Sometimes, especially students, right? You have a nice research question, but then you run some very crazy regressions, and you get, the whole thing gets muddled in the middle, right? And you don't you don't manage to answer your research question. What about the interpretation, the mechanism? Remember, the interpretation, and we had a couple of comments when we were looking at the first paper, a couple of comments on the mechanism and the size of the effects. The size of the effects are very important for policy purposes, because when professional economists, decent professional economists, provide advice to policymakers, the size of the effect matters for policy interventions. Is it correct? Would you like to see some extra results for robustness sake? That's also a fair comment. Alternatives, 2 questions, all alternatives are in order. So you have to provide, so we are still on the comments, criticisms, and suggestions, huh? Right? Alternatives, 2 questions or alternatives are in order. But before the alternative questions, remember, you have to be precise. You are not rewriting the Bible, folks. Right? That has already been done. You don't need to do it again. Right? One is enough. Right? What else can be done with the data set? Is there any other research question that can be addressed, or provide alternative ways of addressing the same research question? That is, perhaps there is a different data set available, or a slightly modified sample or subsample, or perhaps a different IV, if endogeneity is a problem. Okay, this is all, excuse me, this is all part of comments, criticisms, and suggestions. Comments, criticisms, and after criticisms, suggestions. And then the final section of this report, you have to provide the editor with a recommendation. You decide, right? You are going to provide the editor with a recommendation. You have to write a final paragraph where you provide the editor with your recommendation, which is essentially either if it's a bad paper, you reject. You offer, I think, because of the above, given my concerns above, I don't think this paper belongs in this journal, and I recommend a rejection. And it's reject is the word. The paper is being rejected, right? Or you might recommend a revise and resubmit, which is the most common. No, actually, the most common outcome is rejection. Okay. And I'm going to explain a few moments why. Or a revise and resubmit. So the author, the editor is going to provide the authors with a revise and resubmit given your report. So the editor is going to send this report back to the authors, right? And tell the authors, here is a report, or maybe a couple of, usually it's a couple of reports, right? It's blindsided. And I want to, if you want to revise in light of this report, and I'm giving you the right to resubmit, right? And then we take from there. Or after a number of revisions, you can finally accept the paper, right? In this case, folks, because these papers have already, it's just an exercise, because these papers have already been published and they are excellent papers, you are going probably to recommend a revise and resubmit. So now let's see, let's draw some comments. For top journals in the profession, the most common recommendation is a reject. But bear in mind, folks, that this decision doesn't mean all the time that the paper is a bad effort. There are just much more papers, supply of papers, than journals. Demand for papers in the academic market, supply and demand, right? So we have to reject papers. Second most popular decision is a revise and resubmit, or R&R, but without being too enthusiastic about the paper. You provide an R&R because you are feeling generous in a particular day. But in fact, in science, one is never enthusiastic about anything in any way, but always critical. Usually the editor ends up rejecting those papers anyway, right? Sometimes I receive recommendations of revise and resubmission, but you start reading the report, and you start reading between lines, and you see that the referee, is not really very enthusiastic about the paper, and we reject, right? There are other journals in the market. Then there is the revise and resubmit, or the R&R, with a more enthusiastic tone. That's what you are going to provide. Very rare in top journals. And finally, there is the accept, a very almost an extinct species, to provide an acceptance in the very first report. Again, you have to argue why you are recommending what you are recommending. Be precise. It's a paragraph. You know, it's important that you do not waste time on frivolities. A lot of time is wasted on frivolities, right? That is, all papers have flaws. It's science. Papers have flaws. Papers now, maybe one paper now is good. We are going to see the second paper today, later on. We are going to see that the second paper is better than the first paper because it used more innovative data, more disaggregated data. The job, or your job, the job of the referee is not correct grammar obsession. which is a bit of contradiction in Pretoria to have people so obsessed about English grammar. Frankly, folks, come on. You know better than I do what I'm talking about. It's an obsession. We are not interested in grammar, folks. We are not interested in vocabulary. We are interested in the structure of the paper and whether the paper is properly done or not, right? Be precise and provide constructive comments about the contents of the paper so that the paper or science can be improved. You should also highlight what is important, that is corrections that are important to be implemented, and what is not so important, that is suggestions that do not affect publication or rejection of the paper. Lastly, you must always be polite in your report. The importance is substance. Precise, be precise and be collegial. Okay. Some references, let me point out some references which I think are important. The one by John Cochrane, Writing Tips for PhD Students, is the best that you can get out there. He is a professor at Chicago Booth, which is the business school of the University of Chicago, and you can simply press there and download the paper. Clive Granger, Nobel laureate, the guy who invented co-integration, for those of you who are doing time series. He wrote a book, Empirical Modeling in Economics. It's getting old, but it's Cambridge University Press, and it was Clive Granger. It's very nice. I don't know whether this is available from the library or not, but I think it's worth taking, at least browsing that book. David Levine from Berkeley, Dave Levine's Cheap Advice. It's very nice. I think Cochrane's and Levine's stuff are very nice. I highly recommend. Deirdre McCloskey, Economical Writing, which came out in Economic Inquiry back in 1995, is very, very nice. She writes very well. Judea Pearl and Dana Mackenzie, The Book of Why. Coming from Judea Pearl, obviously he had the Bible in mind, the real Bible, the first part, and he wrote this book about the new science of cause and effect. Came out by Penguin. It's a great book. It's really a great book. If you have the chance. Then there is the book by Steven Pinker, and this Judea Pearl is a data scientist. He works with artificial intelligence. But those of you who are interested in artificial intelligence, in AI, will realize, if you know a little bit about artificial intelligence, you will realize that the tools they use in their data science stuff is very similar to the ones we use in economics, right? So this is really, this book is a great help to us. Then there is the book by Steven Pinker, The Sense of Style, The Thinking Person's Guide to Writing the 21st Century, also by Penguin. Steven Pinker is a psychologist, professor of psychology at Harvard. He writes a lot about how people communicate, right? Communication. And it's a great book. Again, if you have the chance, please browse that book. Then there is by William Thompson, Guide for the Young Economist. It's a MIT Press book. It's more for people doing theory, right? You guys are probably doing empirical. So, but I think it's also worth browsing. And then there is also, check the website by Chris Blattman at UChicago on how to write a paper and lots of other things. Let me see if I can actually go there. Let's allow this to happen. Let me just stop sharing and change the screen. So you can see the website by Chris. How to write an essay, how to write lots of things, an outline, summarize, organization, engage with authors' ideas. Lots of other, a lot of information there. He's got this massive blog on, for instance, you can see Professional advice, advice for new assistant profs, applying for PhDs, choosing a Master of Arts, as they call it in the US program. A lot, even how to write an email, right? A lot of information there. It's a massive blog. I think it's worth visiting. And then, folks, what else I find interesting? Chris Blattman, and also some of TED Talks are relevant for what we are doing here, particularly the ones by David Deutsch and Edward O. Wilson. Dave Deutsch, we can go there, is a physicist, Oxford. Let me stop sharing. Sorry, can't find that. Okay. But anyway, the link is broken. But where am I now? Let me go again. So if you press there, you go to the TED Talk by Dave Deutsch. It's a nice talk about how we do science. Edward O. Wilson, formerly Harvard biologist, professor of biology at Harvard, also a giant in how to do science, and he provides advice to a young scientist, you. Right. So those are the references which I find interesting. There are plenty of other references. You can see there is nothing local, no local publisher there or person. I think it's important, again, to bring the best international practices to your doorstep. That is my job. Let me stop sharing. Questions? Comments? Suggestions, criticisms first, suggestions later. Questions? All clear? Okay. Some people have asked me about the picture on my back, because it's do not park bicycles, and then there is a bicycle there. So I took that picture in November 2019 when I was a visiting scholar at the University of Oxford. So this is Oxford. It's a student building, right? Very close to the Foley Bridge. Which is very close to Christchurch College. It's very nice. And I found I find that picture, I took that picture because I found it very quintessential British, right? They are great in creating rules, right? And we here in South Africa, we follow because it is some people will say it is still a colony, but officially speaking, it's a former colony, UK colony, despite best efforts from people in Pretoria. But I found this very interesting because the British, they are very good in creating rules and regulations and institutions, the English common law, which is great, really. But they are also very, very good in breaking their own rules in a very British way. Questions? No questions from your side, folks? Okay, let's have a break. Let's break for 10 minutes, right? So it's 11:15. Let's reconvene at 11:05. Okay, so let me just see how I can pause. So okay, there we go. Let me put this speaker view, cover view, full screen. Okay, there we go. It's better. Okay, let's spend another 45 minutes. Today is going to be a little bit longer because I had to talk about the research proposal and the referee report. The other weeks, next weeks, will be a bit shorter, but today we had to do that so that you have access to all information possible from the very beginning. So let's do the other paper. Let me see where the other paper is. Okay. And let me share my screen. Okay, can you see? I think you can just type. Can you see the screen? Precolonial ethnic institutions in contemporary African development. Can you see that? Just say yes or no, because then I can continue. Okay. So let's talk about this paper, folks. It's essentially very much about the same subject as the previous paper that we saw an hour ago by Stelius and Elias, which is about, again, it's about pre-colonial ethnic institutions and contemporary African development. And that's the title. The title gives the research question. Again, when you write your own papers, your dissertation or your PhD thesis, this is a very strong word. Usually you say paper for everything. But when you write your own stuff, your title has also to be, ideally, has also to be very much to the point, right? Pre-colonial ethnic institutions, so that's what the paper is about, and contemporary African development. So that is essentially, they are telling us the sort of regressions they will be running in a few moments, right? Abstract, let me see, first sentence, the research question, the role of pre-colonial institutions on regional development. What do they do there in the first sentence? They investigate the role of deeply rooted pre-colonial ethnic institutions in shaping comparative regional development within African countries. So they are telling us essentially what this paper is about, and how, even a little bit on how they go about this paper. It's essentially the same stuff, the same story, the pre-colonial ethnic, right? Pre-European colonialism, pre-colonial ethnic institutions in shaping comparative development within African countries, right? The previous paper was about across African countries, although they had also Ugandan data, recall. But this is about recall that or learn from the recall that some African countries, the boundaries that we have now were created by European colonial powers, right? And they do not respect the ethnic boundaries. There are some ethnicities which were essentially cut across the border. We are going to see now in a few moments. So that's what makes these papers essentially the same research question of the previous paper, but using a more disaggregated data set. Okay. And then they provide in the abstract information about the data, distribution of pre-colonial ethnicities, and light density. So they combine information on the spatial distribution of ethnicities. So they have the ethnic boundaries before colonization, with regional variation in contemporary economic performance. How do they proxy for economic performance? Well, they proxy by satellite images of light density at night. So they are using lights, right? Which is also innovative. The data set these guys use, the previous data set was, apart from the centralization variable, everything else I showed you was off-the-shelf data. It was essentially data being provided by the Penward table. Nothing wrong about those data sets, right? But they have been there for quite some time. You do not publish in Econometrica with that sort of data. So these guys, they are going a step forward in terms of putting a more innovative data set together. They use not only the ethnic boundaries, but they also use satellite data, or lights at night, which back then was pretty innovative. Now everybody is already using that sort of data. Okay. What is that they find, folks? The results: political centralization correlates positively with regional development, right? We have seen that before. they document a strong association between pre-colonial ethnic political centralization and regional development. And the pattern is not driven by difference in local geographic features or by other observable ethnic specific culture and economic variables. So they run a lot of robustness tests and when you run a robustness test, folks, in fact, what you are trying to do, you are trying your best to kill the relationship, right? That's what these people are trying to do. You are trying to kill the relationship. And if the relationship is not killed, that means that the relationship is robust. Okay. Let's go to the introduction. First paragraph there, research question, pre-colonial institutions and regional development. Second paragraph is the data. These guys are Greeks. They go very much to the point very early on. The data, similar to the previous paper, in fact, the same anthropological data set put together by Murdoch. They use data from the pioneering work of Murdoch, who has mapped the spatial distribution of African ethnicities and compiled various quantitative indicators reflecting political institutions, cultural and economic traits of several ethnic groups around colonization. What else they find? The data also light density at night as a proxy for development. To overcome the paucity of economic indicators across African ethnic homelands, they combine the anthropological data, the ethnic boundary, with satellite images of light density at night. Okay, of light density at night. Let me made a mistake here. I'm sorry. Let me go back to where I was. Let me stop sharing. And what do we mean by satellite lights at night, folks? What do we mean by that? Okay. We mean, I wanted to show you the picture, but it seems that I can't share that part of my screen. Okay. It's essentially, I can't share. Okay. Let me. What a nightmare Zoom can be sometimes. Okay. It's not okay. Let me stop sharing again. Okay, I'll try again later. Let me see. No, it's not what I want. Anyway, doesn't matter. So it's essentially, folks, let me go there. We're going to see it later anyway. There we go. Let me put this down there. Okay. So essentially they use, and these satellite images of light density at night, essentially this data comes from NASA, right? For those of you, there isn't any one of you here who studied with me before I left University of Pretoria back in 2018. But those of you who probably studied, who did 3 to 5 at some point with me or without me, you probably saw the lights, the NASA satellite images of the planet Earth at night. Okay, and they use, that is essentially data, folks. They use that. Okay, the data, the light density at night. At some point, I'm going to show you the data. What else I found interesting? The results, the analysis shows that the complexity and hierarchical structure of pre-colonial ethnic institutions correlates significantly. Again, they are talking about correlations with content because they don't need to talk about endogeneity, but at the end of the day, they are talking about correlations because they are using historical data, pre-colonial institutions against contemporaneous development. Correlates significantly with contemporary regional development as reflected in light density at night. The results, pre-colonial institutions correlate positively with light density at night. Ethnic institutions, they give a little bit of background, past and present. What else? Related literature, they review the literature there very quickly. Then they give the paper structure. The data on the location of historical ethnic homelands. The data, Murdoch's ethno-linguistic map, just as in the previous paper. This data is available. The starting point in compiling the data set is George Peter Murdoch's 1959 ethno-linguistic map that portrays the spatial distribution of ethnicities across the African continent in the eve of the European colonization, which started the European. I think European colonization is the wrong way of putting that, because apart from the Western Cape, there was very little European colonization in other parts of the continent. But there was European colonialism, right? And if you are familiar with Acemoglu Johnson Robinson, you understand the role of extractive and productive institutions, right? And I am sure you are familiar with that paper. Ethnic institutional traits. Here we are, folks. That is the map, right? That is the ethnic boundaries. Okay, the white map on the left, on my left, the left map is the historical boundaries of ethnicities before colonization, right? And if you zoom in South Africa, you are going to see the different boundaries right before colonization, right? You can see the Zulu there, you can see the Xhosa there, you can see other groups around the Great Zimbabwe before colonization, and you can see also how fragmented. This is Nigeria, right? What we call Nigeria. How fragmented in terms of ethnicities or boundaries, right? This part is, and how much more sparse the South is, right? And then on the right, we see the same ethnic boundaries, right? The same ethnic boundaries, but then they are creating an index, just as in the previous paper, right, of pre-colonial jurisdictional hierarchy beyond local community across groups, or ethnic pre-colonial institutions, right? In the pre-colonial institutions, okay? And you can see that the strong blue there is very much in the north of Africa, right? And then the number 3, which is a sort of light blue, we can see there in what we now call Natal, KwaZulu-Natal, right, in South Africa. And then you can see in here is the Cuba Kingdom, there is a paper about the Cuba Kingdom that we are going to see later on in the course when we talk about culture. We can see also that there were pre-colonial institutions in Madagascar. The whites are essentially no data, ethnicities, homelands. There's 0 there, there is green there in South Africa. So you can see this is essentially the data that they're going to use to run their regressions. First of all, they have the ethno-linguistic boundaries, right? And one thing that we're also going to see as we move along is the scramble for Africa, right? The scramble for Africa, that's when the current boundaries, country boundaries, were decided back in the 19th century, but they didn't take into account the ethnic boundaries, right? Some ethnicities, they were essentially cut in half across boundaries. Okay, folks. What else? And then they talk about satellite light density at night, information about light density at night. The luminosity data come from the Defense Meteorological Satellite Program's operational line scan system that reports images of the Earth at night captured from 2013, 22 hours local time. And the satellite detects lights from human settlements, fires, gas flares, lightning, and the aurora. So the satellite can distinguish between different types of light. And they use, obviously, artificial light to proxy for development. Instead of using GDP, right? Usually we use GDP, but instead of using GDP, they use satellite lights or artificial light, which we know when we look at the map, right? I used to show the students the map. We know that Great Britain is very illuminated, or that England is very illuminated, and Scotland much less so. Okay, and we know that some areas of the United States are very illuminated, and other areas less so, and so on and so forth. Okay. We know that what used to be West Germany is still much more illuminated than what used to be Eastern Germany, which is again not only a proxy for development, but also a proxy for quality of institutions in different countries or within different countries. What else I found interesting? There we go. Let's see what is that. Some validation exercise between wealth and light density, a proxy for development. So what they are doing here, folks, they are essentially correlating the light density, right, on the horizontal axis against household wealth, right? Just to make sure it's just, this is not the regressions they're going to do later on, though. This is just a validation, right? So that they can actually use, they are just showing us that there are positive correlations between GDP or wealth or income and lights, so that they can actually use light density as a proxy for development. Okay. Otherwise, a referee would say, well, why are you using light density instead of GDP? What's the advantage of, or what's the point? Are they correlated in any way? Okay, so they're essentially proving the point that using light density is perhaps even better, because I also recall, I know because I have a paper on that, recall that even within countries, particular presidents from particular ethnicities, they will benefit their own homelands with provision of public goods. Right, and we know, right, that Mbeki benefited the Eastern Cape during his tenure, and we know that the one behind bars benefited KwaZulu-Natal in terms of provision of public goods, in detriment to other provinces. Right. So that's why this is so important, because this data can actually disaggregate those nuances within countries, right? Because we know that, and we are going to see a paper dealing with Kenyan democracy, and we are going to see that particular presidents from particular ethnicities, they benefited their own homelands or their own ethnic boundaries with provision of public goods. Okay. That's why it's the advantage of using this sort of disaggregated data. Again, plenty of interesting research questions to do to better understand, for instance, South Africa. Okay. What else? Summary stats or the descriptives. There we go. What is this? Do I find this interesting? So this is essentially luminosity at the here again we have two types of boundaries. The official on the left, right? The official boundary of the country boundaries, right? And then superimposed the ethnic boundary. Okay. And we can see that some ethnicities, they were cut in half when the contemporaneous African boundaries were put together in Berlin back in the 19th century. Okay, and then we can also see average light density across ethnic groups in Africa. And on the right, we can see again the two types of the boundaries again, but the luminosity in 2007, 2008 at the pixel level. Okay. And this is, for instance, this is 2007, 2008, and this is also 2007, 2008, right? And you can see that the Western Cape and the Eastern Cape, they were more illuminated. And we can see also, given the 2007, 2008, we know when Zuma came into power was 2009, right? But we can see that the Eastern Cape, parts of the Eastern Cape and the Western Cape, where the Xhosa live, were more illuminated. And then, folks, and all these things are important, right? Not because we want to criticize the Xhosa or the Zulu or whoever. That's not the point. They are important because policies are being distorted, right? If someone is getting more than other because of their ethnicity, then there is no welfare gain for the country. Okay, so it's important, if we want to be fair and just to all, we need to look at those things at a more disaggregated level to make sure that policy is being implemented fairly. That's our job. Okay. Ethnic homeland analysis, the empirical framework, that is the regression they are going to run later on. That is in fact the specification, right? The equation. That's not a regression. A regression is what they report in the tables. That is just an equation, okay, or the specification. Okay? So don't call it, when you write a paper, don't call number 1 in your paper a regression, because that's not a regression. That's also a common mistake made by students. So that's the identification strategy, light density at night, which is the Y variable, against jurisdictional hierarchy. So the dependent variable YIC reflects the level of economic activity in the historical homeland of ethnic group I. It's much more, you see, it's much more disaggregated data now in country C, right? Within country C, there are different ethnic groups as proxied by light density at night. So it's essentially at that micro level, light density at night, okay? And then there is this variable there, IQL. IQL, they explain there, denotes local ethnic institutions as reflected in the degree of jurisdictional hierarchy beyond the local level, right? So it's not a small group of people living together without state centralization, right? It's an index capturing the degree of state centralization in particular areas. Okay, for ethnicities that fall into more than one country, each partition is assigned, as I said, the boundaries didn't take into account the ethnic boundaries. The current boundary of South Africa against Namibia didn't take into consideration the ethnic boundary. And more importantly, the current boundary between South Africa and Botswana and South Africa and Zimbabwe also didn't take into account the ethnic boundary. Okay, for ethnicities that fall into more than one country, each partition is assigned to the corresponding country C. For example, regional light density in the part of the Ivi in Ghana is assigned to Ghana, while the adjacent region of the Ivi in Togo is assigned to Togo. Okay, so it's very disaggregated data. It's very nice what they did. It was really a new way at the time of doing research using African data, of learning about Africa, right? Preliminary evidence. Let's see what I found interesting. I think all the tables are at the back, at the very back, at the very end of the paper. You see, the paper has 62 pages, but the appendix is very long. So it's not really that long. So, and nobody reads appendices. So everything that you don't need, you throw into the appendix. Okay. Yeah, so this is just an example, right? This is Zambia. So this is the whole thing here is the map of Zambia, but then there is an ethnic border within Zambia. Okay, here is the ethnic border. Okay, and there is the Lamba on the west and the Lala on the east, and you can see that who is getting more light. Okay. I'm really scratching myself to go to the tables to show you the results, because then we can make sense of the numbers, and we can see the numbers and make sense of the numbers, interpret the numbers, right? Okay, the tables are at that. So the conclusion, the research question again, institutions and development. In this study, they combine anthropological data on the spatial distribution and local institutions of African ethnicities. And this is political economics, is how one group decides the welfare of other groups. How one group in power managed to get into power and decides the welfare not only of his or her, more probably his in Africa group, and also the welfare of other groups, which are being dominated by a particular group. Okay, this is political economy, right? Is this bargaining power between different groups. And bear in mind, we are doing Africa because I think we live in Africa, and I think we have an interest in learning more about Africa instead of just the fiscal policy, monetary policy, and financial flows. If you like, if you fancy that stuff, go for it. But I think you don't learn much about yourselves. But I think if we are, it matters for policy. As I said before, it matters for policy. Okay. Especially in countries which really lack imagination in terms of policy implementation. They study combine anthropological data in spatial distribution and local institution of African ethnicities, and even, as I said, even although even this paper is concerned about the effects of a lot of African papers are concerned about the effects of European colonialism, but also I think you have to understand that we are also talking at the moment that we started disaggregating the data at that level, at the ethnic boundary level. We are also talking about colonialism of particular ethnic groups, African ethnic groups, on other African ethnic groups. Okay, colonialism wasn't invented by the Europeans, as we know, right? So at the moment that we start, you start seeing that there is this whole literature on the importance, or as I said, on the importance of the ethnicity of the president and how that particular president benefits or doesn't benefit his own group, right? There is a large literature on that. But also bear in mind, because this is still very salient in Africa, right? The role of ethnicities. But bear in mind that this is nothing special. There is nothing special about Africa, right? Europe was also divided into tribes, right? Before the Roman expansion, and even very recently, if you go to what we now call Germany, you are going to see that the Germans from Bavaria are very different from the Germans from Lower Saxony, physically speaking. Okay, so they are essentially, in the past, they were from different tribes or different ethnic groups. But what we are interested here, what we are talking about here, is African development. We are not interested in European development. Although understanding European development is also important to understand African development, right? So much about curriculum transformation. Anyway, the results still political centralization correlates positively with development in terms of light density at night. So essentially, they are giving us again the research question, institutions and development, the results, positive correlations between centralization and development. References, usual names there, folks: Acemoglu, Johnson Robinson, all over the place, Alesina, Angrist, and Pischke, mostly harmless econometrics. Remember, we spoke about that book at the very beginning. Galore, Baldwin, Banerjee, Nobel laureate, Robert Bates, Tim Besley, Person, usually the same people, Melissa Tell, right? Jared Diamond, James Fensky, Janayol and Rania, right? With the paper that we, is it the paper that we saw? This is the paper that we saw, right? By Janayol and Rania in the Journal of Economic Growth. Michalopoulos and Papaioannou themselves, right? Murdoch and all the Nunn, Pinkovsky, Laporta, James Robinson, Spolori and Vaxiarg. Same names. Let's see summary stats. I'm not really interested in the summary stats, but they report summary stats or the descriptives. You have to do the same in your paper, right? Number of observations, the mean, the standard deviation, and the quintiles, minimum, maximum of values. So you have to do the same when you write your own paper, right? Your own dissertation or your own research proposal, whatever. I put something there. Basic results, OLS estimates, centralization, light density, jurisdictional hierarchy. Estimates are always positive and statistically significant. And that's and remember, the dependent variable is light density at night, right? Against jurisdictional hierarchy or state centralization. Okay. Also, they use a different variable there, rule of law, and this is also positive against light. Rule of law. It's rule of law is very important, folks. We saw all about it 2 weeks ago. All right, in Natal and Gauteng. Again, very descriptive table, OLS, table 2 reports, OLS estimates. Also look at how to put a table, a professional table together. That's how it should look like. Okay. Another table there. What does it say? What is it? Regressions with fixed effects. Question, we still have time until 12. What is a fixed effect? Let me stop sharing there. What is a fixed effect? What is a fixed effect? Fixed effects. What is a fixed effect? No idea. What is a fixed effect? Come on, guys, we only have 7 people here. Instead, actually, we have 6, apart from me. There is no problem in making mistakes. You are here to learn, and I'm here to give you a hand. What is a fixed effect in a regression? If you have no idea, just let me know. Manuel, we have no bloody idea, but let me know, because then I can tell you what a fixed effect is, so that you can make better sense of the regressions. Okay, so you don't know what a fixed effect is, you know what a fixed effect is, or you don't give a shit of what a fixed effect is. So I'm going to tell you what a fixed effect is, right? It's essentially, if you think in terms of geography of a country, if a country is very dry, that is a fixed effect. If you think in terms of Cape Town, Cape Town is a very inconvenient city, isn't it? Because there is a mountain in the middle. So that mountain, which we call the Table Mountain, is a fixed effect. We cannot change that, right? If the Karoo is very dry, it's inhospitable to humans, that is a fixed effect, right? And then we can account for that in a regression. By doing what? Well, by introducing intercepts, right? Because intercepts don't change. Okay, folks. So it's important that you know what a fixed effect is, so that you can make sense of the regressions. So in here, they also include, you can see there, let me just, you can see there that they include country fixed effects, right? They put yes, 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 yes. So they also include different intercepts for different countries, right? Which account for those, for instance, for things which are essentially fixed, such as the Table Mountain in Cape Town. So the jurisdictional hierarchy again is positive and statistically significant against electricity, and an alternative variable, which also precolonial states, positive and statistically significant. So the importance of precolonial institutions. Paramount chiefdoms is also positive and statistically significant. Binary political centralization is also positive and statistically significant. And then interesting, folks, because that's a sort of, that's what we call a counterfactual. Petty chiefdoms, right? There it is, okay. Petty chiefdoms, which means very fragmented very fragmented political institutions, and then the estimates are essentially zero. Okay, they are not significant. That's a sort of counterfactual. Okay. What else? And then they run, folks, a bunch of otherwise they wouldn't be in econometrica, a bunch of robustness tests. You can, with more variables, less variables, samples and subsamples, different variables accounting for the same thing. But essentially the gist is there, right? It's political centralization against development, which is illustrated in this case by, and then there is a supplementary, as I said, it's the supplementary appendix, which goes on for quite some time. And then they also explain the data in the appendix 4, light density at night. They explain exactly what it is and where it is available from, right? It's available from that website there. Population density is, it comes from the United Nations. Everything that is about populations usually comes from the United Nations. Water area, global ministry mappings. A lot of data coming from American NGOs, which collect data. Also elevation, land sustainability, suitability, malaria. They use a lot of data because they don't run the regressions using all those data, but they use different sets of data for robustness. Then they also explain the precolonial ethnicity level variables, the jurisdictional hierarchy beyond local community, the centralization. We have time. Order variable ranging from 0 to 4, indicating the number of jurisdictional levels or the political complexity in each society. Remember the ethnic boundaries above the local level. A 0 indicates stateless societies, right? Just bands of people. 1 and 2 indicate petty and large paramount chiefdoms. 3 and 4 indicate large states. Okay, and that comes from Murdoch, from the ethnographic atlas, ethnolinguistic atlas. Okay. Okay. Let me stop sharing. Questions, comments, suggestions? Anything? All clear? All clear? Okay, so folks, thanks, Deron. So if it is all clear, my job is done for today. So we meet again next week. Try to take a look at those papers. Try to read the abstract, the introduction, and the conclusion, and to take a look at the pictures that they use to illustrate their results and to show their data. And try also to look at the main tables of results. The first 3 tables of results, to make sure that you know what is going on there. Okay. As I said, standard method, nothing complicated there. They are running OLS regressions with fixed effects. That's something that, if you don't know, I'm sure you know OLS. I'm sure you have run regressions before. Anyway, if you have questions, please try to gather questions and then we can discuss next week. If you need something, send me an email. I usually, if I reply, I reply. If I don't reply, it's because I didn't find the question interesting. Or maybe I will cover the question when we meet again so that all of you can benefit from the question. Okay. Again, questions, comments, suggestions? All clear? Okay, so I see you next week. And I will probably make the video available later on today from my YouTube channel. See you next week, folks. Bye. Let me stop.